Hello, everyone. This week we're studying gender inequality, and we have a really good chapter in the textbook on this topic. And so I encourage you to do the reading this week thoroughly and as best as you can. I'm going to cover some of the topics in the chapter, as well as throwing in a couple of my own ideas here. And we'll start by just looking at some straightforward statistics on gender inequality. These are some of the statistics that are frequently used today to as an indicator of the degree to which there is still inequality between men and women. And one of the most important domains in which there is inequality is in the economic domain of our society. This graph here shows the average pay for white men compared to white women, African American women, and Hispanic women. So we can see on the left here on the average pay for white men, if we look at every dollar for what a white male makes, a white woman makes 77 cents. And an African American woman makes 64 cents, and Hispanic woman makes 56 cents compared to the dollar that a white man makes. So if there's only one statistic that you remember this week, I think it should be this one, because it so clearly reveals how the huge gap that still exists between pay between men and women. There's some other graphs and statistics to illustrate gender inequality. This one shows men's and women's median wages for the years 1973 up to 2005. Now, the median wage is similar to an average, but it's a little bit different. The median is the middle point. So if you take all of the men in our society and rank their wages from highest to the lowest, you would take the middle person and look at his wage, and do the same with women, and then you come up with these statistics here. So let's start on the very left here. For 1973, we see in the red bar so these wages are adjusted for inflation, and I think the important thing here is to look at the gap between the red bar and the yellow bar. So the yellow bar is the median wages for women, and the red bar is the median wage for men. And I think just focusing on that gap is the important thing. Forget about all the other numbers here. I'm not going to ask you a question on the test about these specific numbers. I think just look at the gap here. And there has been some progress made, but as of 2005, women's wages were still only 82% of men's wages. This table here is pretty revealing, and I think this is a more straightforward table than the previous one. This shows the median annual income for women and men for various levels of education. So what's revealed in this table, and probably not surprising, even at different levels of education, women are still paid less than men. So let's start with women and men with less than a high school diploma. The median annual income for women was $21,100 compared to $28,600 for men. And if you kind of just work your way up, you see a similar disparity at higher levels of education. So the same kind of disparity exists for those men and women with a high school diploma, with some college, with an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, a graduate degree. One of the biggest gaps here that's kind of interesting to focus on is the difference between median annual income for men and women for those who have a graduate or professional degree. For women, it's 65,000. For men, it's 94,000. So one takeaway from this chart here is the income gap is greater for the highest levels of education. This graph here shows the gender wage gap in some of the highest paying job areas in our economy. And so after controlling for other factors, age, race, hours, and education, so kind of holding other things constant, we're looking at um, the percentage of pay that women make compared to men in each of these occupational categories. So, for example, in the field of financial specialists, women make 66% of what men make. That's a significant gap. Um, Other areas, podiatrists, brokerage clerks, physicians, aircraft pilots, these are all basically pretty darn good jobs that people really aspire to, and they tend to require higher levels of skill and education, and so you can see the pay gap there. One of the long-standing problems with gender inequality is that women have long been segregated in what are oftentimes low-paying positions. So not necessarily always the case that they're low-paying positions, but this table here at least gives us a glimpse into this idea that if we look at secretaries, those occupations in our economy that are classified as secretary, 98.1% of the people working in those positions in 1970 were women. And that hasn't changed much, so surprisingly. By 2007, it only declined to 96.1%. So the same kind of thing with RNs and dental assistants. You still have women highly segregated in some occupations. And sometimes, in some cases, these occupations pay a lower wage or salary than others. And so this is kind of one of the problems. Although that's not always the case. Again, I think registered nurses make a pretty good wage. The next three occupations, carpenter, airline pilot, auto mechanic, tend to pay pretty well, but it illustrates again the segregation of women in certain jobs and their absence in others. And so in 1970, only 1.6% of carpenters were women. That only increased to 1.9% by 2007. Airline pilots, female airline pilots increased from 1.6% in 1970 to 4.9% in 2007. And in the same case with auto mechanics. Now, having looked at some of the inequality in pay, in our economy between men and women, there has been, what we could think of as progress that women have made over the course of the last century in our economy and other areas of social life. Here's a table that I took directly from chapter 16 that you're reading this week, and it shows the labor force participation rates of women going way back from 1880 up to 2011. The top line here is for married women with children 16 to 17 years old. The bottom line is married women with children under 6 years old. And so the message here is that women are, in general, work a lot more. And in particular, married women are working a lot more than they used to. It really started to increase around 1950. And so the idea that women should be in the home or women are not participating is a thing of the past. So the labor force participation rate, I should have said, is an indication of those people who are either working or even if they're unemployed, they're actively looking for work. And so it's just this overall indication of people who are participating in the labor market. Here's a table that shows, some progress that women have made, although there's still a gap in certain higher skill professions. And the bar graphs show the progress from 1930 up to 2007. So you can see if you go to the very bottom there, you can see the color codes for the various years: 1930, 1960, 1990, 2000, and 2007. And so there have been some significant gains. For example, today, 2007, we'll call that today, it's a little bit behind still, but 25% of architects are women. 30%, close to 35% of women make up the lawyers and judges. Another 30% of physicians and surgeons are women. And the number of women working as policemen and detectives has increased significantly to it's about 25%. This graph shows how women have more and more, especially since the 1970s, are entering medical and law schools. The red bar is represents the percentage of women who are enrolled in medical schools in the United States. The blue bar represents the percentage of women who are enrolled in law schools in the United States. So there is a pretty incredible increase here. If we look at 1969, 1970, less than 10% of those who were enrolled in the medical school or law school in the United States were women. So, and that's increased to today where close to 50% of those students who are in medical school or law school are women. This chart here shows the percentage of women who are working high up in the corporate world. The bottom line doesn't show actually very much progress. It shows some progress. The bottom red line represents the percentage of women working as CEOs in the largest firms, those firms that have 1,000 or more employees. So those are pretty high up, very powerful kinds of positions in large corporations. Going back to 1972, it's only been really less than 1% of these large firms have had a woman as a CEO. And that's only increased to today somewhere around 3%. So that's still a pretty low figure. Now, if we move into the red line at the top here on the right, this is for corporate officers in the largest 500 firms. So these firms are not as big, not as powerful, but there is a higher percentage of women working as the CEOs for smaller firms. So today it's something like 16% of corporate officers in these middle range companies are women. Here's another table from the chapter, and this shows some progress that women have made as elected officials. You can look at the um, if you look at the upper left-hand corner, you can see the definitions for the color of the bar charts here, of the bars in the bar chart. And so it shows the percentage of elected officials who are women in the U.S. House of Representatives, United States Senate, the percentage of women who are governors, and the percentage of women who work in the state legislature. So overall, without kind of going into the details of each of these bars and the numbers, women have made some progress. So if we look at 2013, something like 20% of the U.S. House of Representatives and Senators are women, about 15% of governors are women, and about 25% of those politicians in state legislatures across the country are women. And these are significant gains since the 1970s. A lot of the gains in our economy and in more participation in the labor force, um, gains in wages and salaries, although there's still a big disparity, um, gains in gaining access to political institutions and educational institutions have come about through legal means, through legislation, through activism, and so on. So here's an interesting uh, right that women gained, and it wasn't until 1920 that women had the legal right to vote and actively participate in our political process. So this took quite a while for this right to be recognized. A couple of other pieces of information. This is from the chapter. In 1930, women were given the right to own a passport. By the 1940s, women had an equal right to divorce. Prior to that, it was completely in the control of men. Women gained considerable reproductive rights. in 1973 with the Supreme Court decision Roe versus Wade. We talked about some important pieces of civil rights legislation that came out in the 1960s last week. And many of these laws also applied to women. So in the 1960s, women were given, in law, equal right to university admissions, equal rights to access to jobs and equal pay, and equal rights to participate in sports. This was particularly important at the collegiate level. And so many of the gains that have been made by women can be attributed to this civil rights legislation. I threw this in here just out of interest, and there's, most universities and colleges have departments of gender studies, and it's become an important part of the curriculum for many departments. Urban studies and planning, for example, some of our courses explicitly integrate issues of gender and gender studies into the curriculum. And here are some journals that are dedicated specifically to gender studies. This is the Journal of Gender Studies. There's another one here, International Journal of Gender and Women's Studies. Here's another one, Gender, Place, and Culture, a Journal of Feminist Geography. So, there's a number of other gender, feminist-related journals and periodicals out there. I set up a link on Canvas to watch a couple of videos by John Oliver. And in one, he discusses the Equal Rights Amendment. And I'll let you take a look at this. He does a really good job of kind of reviewing the history of women's attempt to have Equal Rights Amendment voted into the Constitution of the United States. Finally, a few thoughts on changing gender relations. The authors talk quite a bit about changing gender relations over the course of the last century, and there has been quite a bit of change. They start by discussing definitions of sex and gender. Sex, on the one hand, refers to the biological differences between females and males. In a way, this is similar to last week's discussion about race. There are some biological differences here, obviously, between men and women. The gender part of the equation refers to the social and cultural meaning attached to sex, attached to femininity and masculinity. So here's some charts and graphs that illustrate the changing gender relations in our society over the last several decades. And here's one that shows the number of divorces for every 1,000 marriages. Divorce today is a pretty common thing. Just about half of all marriages today end in divorce. Divorce is much more accepted today socially, and going back to the 30s and 40s and even the 50s, divorce was there's a much greater stigma, I should say, attached to divorce. And so this is part of a changing, evolving gender gender social relations in our society. This chart here shows the percentage of births to unmarried women. This is another social norm that has changed considerably in our society since the 50s and 60s. Today, approximately 40% of births in our society are to unmarried women. And it's much more accepted and much more common today to know somebody who has children out of marriage. This chart here shows the percentage of women aged 30 to 34 who have never married. Again, part of a changing gender relations. This chart here shows the percent of households that consist of a married couple. By 2008, and this is still about the same today, so it's about half of households consist of a married couple. So I didn't talk too much about this, but if you go into the chapter, the authors have a kind of an interesting discussion of these changing gender relations. And then finally, some areas where women are fighting for more progress. This is in the area of pay equity, being paid for comparable work. Childcare is another critical issue for women to achieve gender equality. And the authors also talk about parental paid leave. If we look at this following chart here, this really shows a lack of support that the United States has for parents and for women who have children. In Sweden and Germany, people get about 45 weeks of paid leave after giving birth. And that in the United States, there's no mandatory paid leave. There's no law that requires it. Some companies give voluntary paid leave, but there's no federal law requiring it. And I put up another link to one more video by John Oliver, and this is on paid leave. It's pretty funny. And so, okay, so that's all I have. I know I went over some of that kind of fast, but hopefully that will help you dig into the chapter and the reading for this week. If you have any questions, please give me an email. Thanks.